1967. The Betty Andreasen abduction. Just the thought of alien abduction makes most of us turn away in confusion and disbelief. However, we must confront this issue, as it is an integral part of the UFO mystery. Though abduction itself may seem unlikely, some abductions fall into the truly bizarre category. One of these cases is the abduction of Betty Andreasen that occurred on the night of January 25th, 1967, in the town of South Ashburnham, Massachusetts. This riveting case has become a mainstay of UFO literature. Betty was in her kitchen around 6:30 p.m. on the night of her abduction. The rest of her family, 7 children, her mother, and father were in the living room. The lights in the house began to blink, and a red light beamed into the house through the kitchen window. Betty's children were on edge after the lights blink, and she ran to quiet them. Startled by the red beam, Betty's father ran to look out of the kitchen window to see where the light was coming from. He was amazed to see 5 strange creatures heading up toward their house in a hopping motion. He was startled to see the creatures simply walk through the wooden door of the kitchen right into the house. In a moment, the entire family was put into a type of trance. Betty's father would be attended by one of the creatures, while another began to have telepathic conversations with Betty. She and her father both thought that one of the creatures was the leader. He was about 5 feet tall. The other 4 were approximately a foot shorter. They had very wide eyes, small ears and noses, set in a pear-shaped head. There were only slits where their mouths should have been. They only communicated with their minds. The 5 creatures wore a blue coverall with a wide belt. On their sleeves could be seen a logo of a bird. 3 fingers were on their hands, and their feet were shod with boots. They did not actually walk, but floated as they moved along. Betty later would recall that she was not frightened by their presence, but instead felt calm. Meanwhile, Betty's mother and children were still in a state of suspended animation. When Betty seemed worried about them, the aliens released her 11-year-old daughter from the trance to assure her that no harm was being done to her family. Soon, Betty was taken by the aliens to a waiting craft, which rested on a hill outside of her home. Betty estimated the craft to be about 20 feet in diameter and saucer-shaped. Betty recalls that after she was aboard the UFO outside of her house, the craft took off and joined a mothership. There, she was subjected to a physical examination and the victim of tests by strange equipment. She was given one test which caused her pain, but resulted in being a religious awakening. She estimates that she was gone for 4 hours before being brought home by 2 of the aliens. Returning home, she ran to see the rest of her family. They were yet in some kind of suspended state. All along, one of the aliens had waited behind with her family. Finally, they were released from the bonds of the trance, and the aliens left. Betty had been hypnotized and told not to reveal any details of her experience. Though some of the details of her abduction were temporarily lost to her, some things she would be able to recall. She remembered the power outage, the red beam of light coming into the house, and the aliens coming. Some 8 years after her experience, she answered an ad from researcher Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He was soliciting for anyone who may have had an alien experience. The letter she sent to Hynek was rejected, however, being too bizarre to be believed. 2 more years would transpire before her story would be investigated. The group of investigators included an electronics engineer, an aerospace engineer, a telecommunications specialist, a solar physicist, and a UFO investigator. Betty's case of alien abduction was very strange. Yet a very good case for investigation, containing much more information than the average case. 12 months of in-depth study went into the case. Betty was involved in character analysis, polygraph examinations, psychiatric review, and 14 sessions of regressive hypnosis. The results? Betty, along with her daughter, agreed in all basic details of the case. The results of this analysis were presented in a 528-page review. The review basically stated that Betty and her daughter were sane individuals, believing in their experience as presented. The Betty Andreasen Luca abduction is a case which still is discussed today by UFO investigators. 1967. The Herbert Shermer abduction. 22-year-old policeman Herbert Shermer would have a bizarre experience on December 3rd, 1967. While making his normal patrol rounds in Ashland, Nebraska, he saw what appeared to be red lights atop a large truck. He had checked locations along Highway 6 and just hit the intersection of 2 highways, 6 and 63, when he saw the red lights. He would get a closer look. As he continued down Highway 63, he came to a stop and shined his headlights on the red-lighted object. He immediately knew the object was no truck. The red beaming lights were coming through what Shermer described as portholes. He could clearly see a disc-shaped, metallic UFO that was hovering about 8 feet off the ground. The polished, aluminum object had a type of walkway around its circumference. He could also see what he thought were legs below the object. The UFO began to send flames below it as it rose into the air. Shermer could hear a siren sound coming from the object as it rose higher and higher. The UFO then passed directly over his police car, then flew out of sight. Shermer sped back to the police station, making a note of the time as 3 a.m. This shocked him because he knew he had been on patrol much longer than 10 minutes the present time indicated. Shermer made the following entry into his log. Saw a flying saucer at the junction of Highways 6 and 63. Believe it or not. Shermer began to experience some physical problems right after his sighting. He suffered from headaches, felt ill, and had a red welt on his neck. The Condon Commission, located at the University of Colorado, and at the time investigating UFO sightings, heard of Shermer's sighting and requested that he come to Boulder, Colorado. On February 13th, 1968, Shermer would undergo regressive hypnosis administered by psychologist Dr. Leo Sprinkle of the University of Wyoming. The regression sessions would bring about many new details that Shermer had suppressed. As he neared the UFO, the engine in his police patroller failed, and his radio went dead. Some type of white object emerged from the UFO and communicated with him telepathically. This object kept Shermer from drawing his firearm. Other facts recalled by the patrolmen were that the beings from the ship were friendly. They powered their UFO through the electric lines and had a base of operation on the planet Venus. The Condon Committee concluded that evaluation of psychological assessment tests, the lack of any evidence, and interviews with the patrolmen left project staff with no confidence that the troopers' reported UFO experience was physically real. Psychologist Dr. Sprinkle, however, felt that Shermer believed in the reality of the events he described. When Shermer returned to his duties in Ashland, Police Chief Woloskin resigned, and Shermer was appointed as new chief. But because of ridicule from the citizens and the UFO experience, he was not able to rightfully perform his duties and resigned 2 months later. Someone had thrown dynamite into his patrol car, and his wife left him during this time. Looking for relief from his psychological problems, he would undergo more regressive hypnosis in June of 1968. Hypnotist Loring G. Williams conducted the sessions, which would reveal many more details of his encounter with the UFO. There would be 2 books written about his experiences: Gods, Demons, and Space Chariots, and Gods and Devils from Outer Space by Eric Norman. It is very difficult to ascertain whether or not Shermer's experience was real or imaginary. 1968. The Buff Ledge Alien Abductions. A valid account of the alien abduction of 2 teenage counselors comes to us from the state of Vermont. 4 UFOs would appear in daylight over the lake of Buff Ledge Camp, making baffling maneuvers with the lightness of a falling leaf. On August 7, 1968, the strange encounter began for 16-year-old Michael Lapp, maintenance man for the camp, and 19-year-old Janet Cornell, water ski instructor. The camp was located north of Burlington on Lake Champlain. The 2 were taking a break on a boat dock. On a warm afternoon, the camp was sparsely inhabited because the swimming team had gone to Burlington for a meet. In the later part of the afternoon, Michael and Janet were simply enjoying the view of the setting sun when suddenly a bright light appeared. Was this light an extraordinary view of Venus or something else? Their question would soon be answered as the source of light began to drop down toward the 2 friends. As the object grew closer, the shape became more clear as it was saucer-shaped. Suddenly, Michael remarked, "Wow, Venus is falling." But he knew better. The lone light now dropped 3 smaller lights from it, and they immediately soared over the lake. The larger objects soon disappeared from sight. It was obvious the objects were being intelligently controlled. The UFOs seemed to perform for the 2 mesmerized teenagers, doing zigzags, loops, and then would suddenly drop like a falling leaf. Now, the 3 UFOs moved even closer to the 2 friends. The UFOs formed a triangle formation, and then 2 of them pulled away, leaving just 1 out front. Later, Michael would recall hearing something that sounded like 1,000 tuning forks as the 2 objects pulled back. The last UFO then passed right over them, shot upward, and briefly disappeared. Soon it would reappear, tilted to one side, then drop straight into the lake. After a time, it would emerge from the lake and then begin moving directly toward Michael and Janet. The UFO was so close now, the 2 beings could be seen through the transparent cupola of the object. The beings appeared childlike. According to Michael, their necks were elongated. They had big heads for their body size. They had no hair, but large eyes which wrapped around the side of their heads. He thought that he was in mental contact with the beings. For some odd reason, as Michael watched the aliens, he slapped his knee. one alien did likewise. The UFO was now directly over their heads as it shot a beam at the two. Michael grabbed Janet's shoulders and pulled back, landing both of them on the deck on their backs. He then was terrified of being taken and screamed, "We don't want to go!" The next thing Michael recalled was sitting on the deck and gazing at the object, which was now farther away from them. Janet seemed to just sit in a trance. It was now totally dark. Soon, they heard members of the swim team talking as they made their way back into the camp. The UFO moved higher up into the sky. It flashed its lights a number of times and then disappeared. Michael wondered, how long had we been here? Nothing would be said about what happened that late afternoon. When summer camp ended, the two went their separate ways. Michael rarely thought about his experience for the next 5 years, but as time went on, he began to have disturbing dreams. 10 years after Michael's experience, he decided to contact the Center for UFO Studies. He was referred to investigator Walter Webb. After becoming familiar with the details of the case, Webb suggested regressive hypnosis to relieve Michael's nightmares and hopefully regain his lost memories. The sessions brought back the events of the late afternoon experience at Buff Ledge. But now, he recalled being lifted by a beam into the waiting UFO and going into a larger UFO. He also remembered Janet lying on an examination table. The being shone a light into her eyes, took skin samples and fluids from her body. The aliens all looked alike, Michael recalled, and had those large eyes, a mouth without lips, no ears, and 2 small openings for a nose. Michael also described the beings as having 3 pointed, web-like digits for fingers, and their bodies felt damp and clammy. Michael recalls the aliens wanted life on our planet to be like theirs, without violence. Janet, now 29, would also be regressed. Her recalled memories would only strengthen the case of alien abduction. She recalled the coldness of the table. Something had pulled her hair and pinched her neck. There was no disharmony in Michael and Janet's statements. Webb also conducted an investigation outside the boundaries of regressive hypnosis. He was able to find other members of Buff Ledge that had witnessed strange lights over Lake Champlain on the same night as Michael and Janet's abduction. 2 other members of the camp also claimed to have been abducted after seeing strange lights, but earlier in the summer. Their names were not released, and the events at Buff Ledge Camp are certainly proof of an alien abduction. 1973. The Pascagoula, Mississippi alien abductions. On the night of October 10th, 1973, there was a UFO sighting by 15 different witnesses who saw a strange, unknown object fly over a housing project in St. Tammany Parish, New Orleans, Louisiana. 2 of the witnesses were policemen. The sighting would only be the beginning of what was to occur the next night on the nearby Pascagoula River. 2 fishermen, 19-year-old Calvin Parker and 42-year-old Charles Hickson, were about to have an experience that would forever change their lives. Parker and Hickson were continual fishing buddies. They were both living in the town of Gautier, Mississippi. On one particular night, they were fishing the waters of the Pascagoula River when they heard a strange sound, a type of buzzing. The 2 men immediately turned to see what was the source of the strange noise. They were shocked to see an egg-shaped object with bluish front lighting. The object was only a few feet above the water and about 10 yards from the two frightened fishermen. While they sat stunned, looking at the weird flying machine, a door opened in the UFO, and to their utter amazement, 3 beings of unknown origin began to float toward the two. The beings did have legs, but they did not use them. They literally floated across the water toward Hickson and Parker. The two fishermen would later attempt to describe what the beings looked like. About 5 feet tall, had bullet-shaped heads without necks, slits for mouths, and where their noses or ears would be, they had thin, conical objects sticking out like carrots from a snowman's head. Hickson sat frozen on the riverbank. Suddenly, 2 of the odd-looking beings grabbed him, while the third being snatched Parker, who immediately fainted from fear. The beings supported Hickson by literally holding up his body. As they did, he felt numbness over his entire body. By some power he could not see, he was floated into the bows of the waiting object to a brightly lit room. The room had no gravity. He floated with a strange eye-like device. The device would go over his entire body as if it was scanning him. After the eye-like device was finished with Hickson, he was left floating in the room alone. The beings had probably left to examine Parker. Approximately 20 minutes after the ordeal had begun, it was over. Hickson was now floated back out of the craft. Back on the riverbank, he could see Parker, who was crying and praying on the ground. Shortly, the strange flying object rose straight into the night sky and flew away. After some time to regain their senses and strength, they began to talk about what action they should take. At first, they were afraid to report their experience, but they felt obligated to tell someone. What if these beings were taking other people in the area? Fighting fears of public ridicule, they called Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi. They were instructed to report their incident to the local sheriff's department. Not wanting to deal with local law enforcement, they decided instead to go to their local newspaper office. The office was closed, which left the men only one recourse: the sheriff's office. As would be expected, the local sheriff thought their story was a hoax or trick. Trying to get to the bottom of their story, the 2 fishermen were placed in a room wired for sound. It was thought that they would discuss the joke between themselves, and their story would be found out. This was not to be. Soon law enforcement personnel knew that something had certainly frightened Hickson and Parker, and that this was no joke. It would be no time until details of the alleged abduction began to leak out to the public. First, the account of the incident was published in local newspapers, soon followed by the wire services. In a matter of a couple of days, the Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction was a big news item over the entire United States. Aerial Phenomena Research Organization sent University of California professor James Harder to investigate the story. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who represented the U.S. Air Force, also would research the case. Harder and Hynek did a lot of the investigative work together. The 2 well-known researchers first interviewed the 2 fishermen together. Harder tried to do regressive hypnosis on Hickson, but the abductee was so frightened that the hypnosis was stopped. To get things off on solid ground, both of the witnesses took polygraph tests, and both passed without a problem. Harder and Hynek both believed that the two tormented men were telling the truth. Esteemed UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek would proclaim that there was definitely something here that was not terrestrial. Even after 30-plus years, both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson still testify to the same story and have never wavered in their account of what happened that October night on the Pascagoula River. There have been many articles, magazine reports, and television documentaries done on the case, and the two men gave numerous interviews about their experience. Their account, although bizarre, is one of the best researched and documented alien abduction cases in UF history. 1975. Abduction of Sergeant Moody. On August 13, 1975, Air Force Sergeant Charles L. Moody was in the desert of Alamogordo, New Mexico, observing a meteor shower. It was 1:15 a.m. when he saw a glowing, metallic saucer-shaped object lowering to the ground approximately 300 feet away. Moody estimated the object's length at about 50 feet and its diameter at 18 to 20 feet. The UFO began to wobble as it descended. Moody was extremely frightened as the object began to move towards him. Moody tried to run from the object, but when he tried to start his car, the engine would not respond. He could now hear a high-pitched sound as the object came to a stop in mid-air about 70 feet away from him. He could make out a window in the UFO and see shadows of a human-like form. The high-pitched sound came to a stop, and as it did, he could feel his body going numb. His last conscious memory would be of the UFO rising back up into the sky and finally flying away. As the UFO left, Moody was now able to start his car. Still trembling with fear, he sped away from the desert, finally arriving home. As he entered his house, he was shocked to see that it was now 3 a.m. Somehow, he was missing about 1.5 hours. The next day, he began to have physical problems, starting with severe pain in his lower back. A rash would break out all over his body in the next few days. Taking his problems to a physician, he was told to try a type of self-hypnosis to recover the lost 1.5 hours. It seems that the self-hypnosis was working. Within a couple of weeks, Moody began to recall bits and pieces of his desert encounter and felt that he had a fairly good account of what had happened to him. He now believed that after his body became numb, he had seen two beings coming towards him. The creatures were about 6 feet tall and wearing skin-tight black clothing. He had tried to fight them off, but was overcome with the numbness and went unconscious. He remembered waking inside of the craft on a table. He could not move his arms or his legs, as an alien creature stood by him. This alien was much shorter than his two abductors. He also wore a silvery suit instead of black. He had no hair on his head like the other two creatures. His brow protruded outward, and he had round eyes, small ears and nose, and his lips were extremely thin. This leader, as Moody saw him, began to communicate telepathically. Moody was asked if he would stop fighting his abduction and cooperate. With Moody's compliance, the alien used a rod-like device on his back, which stopped the paralysis. Soon, Moody was transported to a different part of the UFO, where he was shown the alien drive unit. This drive had a long rod and 3 holes in it which were covered by glass. There was a crystal-like object with a rod on both ends. During his short tour of the alien ship, Moody was told that there was a larger mothership which was waiting above the Earth. The alien leader also told him that no future contact with Earthlings would be made for 20 years. Also, Moody's memory would be lost to him for several weeks after he was released. The alien then rendered him unconscious once again. It's very difficult to make an assessment of the validity of Moody's claims. Investigator Jim Lorenzen took exception to some of his claims. In 2 separate accounts, Moody gave the distance of the mothership from Earth as 2 different amounts, and he also claimed the aliens were robust 6-foot-tall creatures, but also called them frail. On the other hand, Moody was examined by Charles McQuiston, inventor of the psychological stress evaluator, which allegedly proves if a person is telling the truth. McQuiston determined that Moody was indeed being truthful about his encounter.